Yeah, I'm going to start the recording now. Okay, so we are going to run through a couple of quick housekeeping slides. We have a brief budget presentation on PowerPoint, which we'll be running through, and it should take about maybe 15, 20 minutes. I take questions immediately following that. As noted in the email, we have the pleasure of having our State Chancellor, Dr. Jack Scott, with us today. We also have Vice Chancellor Dan Troy, and we have Scott Lay, President and CEO of the Community College League. In terms of kind of housekeeping, as I mentioned, this call is going to be recorded, and it'll be available at CCC Confer later this afternoon. There are media on the call, so folks just be aware that there are individuals from the media who will also be participating in this call. In addition, questions are going to be taken only via web chat, so you need to be online and submit your question online to have it answered after the conclusion of the slides. I understand that the phones obviously are working, but it will be very disruptive to try to filter through and answer questions on the phone. We're expecting over 400 participants on this webinar.
You can the books go in because likely that has not failed.
So just if you're listening online on your computer, you obviously know to control the sound volume by the audio teleconference located at the bottom left. And the next slide is dealing with how to send text chat messages, and again, that's the only way you're going to be able to ask a question during the webinar. And this is also being closed captioned by the CCC Confer team. So with that, we'll kind of launch into the webinar in the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Dan Troy.
Thank you, Teresa. I'm glad to have so many of you online today, and happy to go over the budget with you and working in cooperation with our partners from the League. I think this will be a very informative event, and I'm looking forward to your questions. First, we'll do a quick review, as Teresa said, on 12th budget. At the time the budget was passed, as you know by now, we took a direct $400 million to our base apportionment. Also, we took an increase in fees up to $36 per unit beginning with the fall of the 11-12 year. Additionally, as part of the budget agreement, certain trigger cuts were input into the budget if it was found that revenues were not tracking with the budget assumptions. Indeed, those revenues did not track those budget assumptions. Took a couple of year hits, a total of $102 million, the 11-12 year, bringing the total to $502 million, and another $10 increase effective with the summer. If you net the two, the fee revenues together with that cut, we seem to have an ongoing cut of about $385 million. I would like to remind you once again to press star 6 on your phone to mute you. We're not able to do lecture mode right now, so we're going to have to rely on you to press star 6 and use those phones during the presentation. Turning to the next slide, the 11-12 year, we have an increasing percentage of students applying for the BOG fee waivers. So to the extent that the governor's budget assumes that we're going to collect a certain amount of fee revenues, and those revenues don't come in, there's the risk of a deficit. The general fund would not have backfilled the amount of revenue that we need to fund our system as anticipated. So that is definitely one area of concern for us for the 11-12 year. Another major area of concern relates to the RDA proposals. With the elimination of the RDAs, the governor is assuming that there'll be approximately $147 million in new local revenue available to the system, and they are proposing to take down a like amount of general fund to net that out. There's a risk that those funds won't come in as anticipated, so we're going to be watching that very carefully over the next few years. Moving on to the 12-13 budget scenario, the governor's forecast does show that due to many of the severe reductions the state has approved in recent years, that the overall deficit is reducing over time. The operational deficit he shows for the 12-13 year before any changes is a little over $5 billion. They do roll in $4.1 billion from prior year problems, give us a total of $9.2 billion as our starting point problem for the 12-13 year. Over the next few years on the natural, the governor shows that deficit would be down to a little less than $2 billion. Moving to the governor's proposed solutions in 212, he proposes $4.2 billion in cuts. A major chunk of that in the CalWORKS program, as you can see on the pie chart on the left. Additionally, he proposes raising revenues $6.9 billion through a ballot initiative that would be on the November ballot. That would be a tax on higher income earners and also a half-cent increase in the sales.
And this is Scott and jumping in. We wanted to highlight, in addition to the Proposition 98 cuts, which we'll be talking about mostly in this presentation, we wanted to highlight the $301 million in Cal Grant cuts, as well as the disproportionate hits that California's poor residents are taking in this budget. $2 billion is being cut out of CalWORKS, IHSS, and Medi-Cal, largely because, like education, that's where the money is. But we realize that that's going to disproportionately impact community college students and their families. Additionally, the Cal Grant changes to the grade point average requirement, which we'll be sending out more information to you shortly about, would disproportionately impact community college students. So we wanted to highlight that our concerns are not only about the community college part of the budget, but some of the other parts that serve our students and their families.
Points well taken. Here you see some detail on the governor's tax proposal, roughly as I described earlier. Another concern that the LEO just raised today is that the LEO seems to think that the governor's assumptions on revenues may be a little bit optimistic. So we'll have to track that as time goes on as well. The governor's estimating he'll get $6.9 billion out of that. The ledge analyst thinks it may be more in the $4.5 billion range. So those it has to do with the volatility of the high income person. If the tax initiative doesn't pass, the governor, for a second year in a row, would propose some budget triggers. As you see on the top line there, Prop 98 is slated for about $4.8 billion in cuts should those triggers hit. A big chunk of that money, about $2.4 billion, I believe, has to do with a deferral buyback. The new money that the governor puts on the table for us in 12-13 is only for buying off the existing deferrals that the system has taken on over the years. So it's not really new money that the colleges have available to spend on programs. Budget fails, the first thing that goes away is that $218 million. So it's not much of a hit to us. But we are asking for costs beyond that for general obligation debt service. Fitting those costs into the system require cuts of program expenditures. So that would be a pretty significant hit to the system. It looks like about $280 million or so. And now I'll hand it over to Scott.
And this slide explains what Dan was talking about. The governor proposes $52.5 billion in a Proposition 98 funding guarantee in 2012-13. That's a sizable increase, about $5 billion from last year, although about half of it is used to undo one-time solutions primarily on the K-12 side of the house. And so programmatically, it's about a $2.5 billion increase in Prop 98 spending this year, although most of it, as Dan highlighted, would be used for the deferral buyback, and we'll talk more about that. What you'll see, though, is that little yellow bar in the presentation you see $2.6 billion being put into Proposition 98. So not only do you have, with the failure of the taxes, this drop in the Prop 98 guarantee, you also have $2.6 billion of additional new expenditures under Prop 98, crowding out programs within the guarantee. We have two budget scenarios. Those of you that were around for last year's fight, remember that we're now coming out with budget scenarios. I'll talk to you in a moment about the availability of district-specific scenarios. But Scenario A, this is the governor's budget as proposed, including passage of the tax measure on the November ballot, would buy back the deferrals and would provide a $12.5 million mandates block grant to community colleges. We're still waiting to see the exact language on that. That'll be in a trailer bill with the details of the allocation methodology and how it actually buys back some of the unfunded mandates over the past several years. Scenario B has no deferral buyback, no mandates block grant, and that $264 million base cut, which we believe would be taken as a workload reduction of around 5.56%. And I apologize that I didn't get that number in this particular slide, but it's about 5.56% that we project would be the workload reduction in the 12-13 fiscal year. Under both scenarios, the governor is proposing, as part of a K-14 categorical policy change, he's proposing a consolidation of all categorical programs totaling $411.6 million, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. This very crazy chart just shows what happens with the deferrals. We'd be reducing the inter-fiscal year deferrals from $961 million down to $743 million. This may result in districts having modestly lower borrowing costs, but not really, because these are rolling deferrals that are already built into the cash flows of districts. But it would reduce the wall of debt that the governor has identified that has really complicated the state's budget and made it harder for the state to borrow money to meet its cash flow needs, which they do on the private market, like many of our college districts do to meet cash flow. On categorical flexibility, and I'll be honest with you, we just saw the language this morning while the budget was released early last Thursday. The budget bill language was not released until this morning. 15 categorical programs would be made completely flexible to be used for any categorical or student service purpose. 3 categorical programs, disabled foster care education and telecommunications and technology, would be restricted to current use. That's the extent of the language we have right now. Funds would be allocated to districts in the same proportion that they received in the 2011-12 fiscal year, and we'll talk a little bit later about our response to this proposal. Actually, we'll talk about it in just a moment. But first, I want to turn it over to our leader, a great partner of the league and all of you, Chancellor Jack Scott. I know the Chancellor's got a flight to catch, so we're going to let him speak, and he may not be around for all of the Q&As. But if you submit any questions you have for the Chancellor, we'll try and prioritize those in the queue. Chancellor?
Well,
Folks, just remind you that you need to fix your phones. We were unable to go into lecture mode, so please make sure you start.
well, thank you, Scott. I guess after that garbled information you just received, you probably thought the Chancellor had sort of lost his mind. But the reality is that, just as always, we are still facing some very difficult times. We are very much interested in seeing the November ballot tax initiative passed, because it would mean some relief for community colleges, particularly in the way of deferrals. However, if it doesn't pass, then the setting table, and of course, all of you, whether you happen to be the CEO of a district or whether you're the chief business officer, you know that we've gone through some very lean times. In fact, one statistic that might be of interest to you, that since the 2007-8 academic year, spending per student, when adjusted for inflation, has declined by 10.6%. That just simply means that each community college student, we are not able to spend but 90% of what we spent 3 years ago. And of course, not only that, but we've had to cut back on the number of students that we admit. Frankly, there have been thousands of students that have been turned away, not because we refused to admit them, but because they came to our campuses and found that no class was available. If the tax initiative passed, we will get $218 million in additional funding, which now the governor says that it will be used to buy back deferrals. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind, those of you who have studied the budget way in which it is brought out, remember that the governor proposes a budget. However, the legislature then, in turn, makes their additions, amendments, deletions, and so forth from the budget. For instance, on the categorical flexibility, I would have to say to you that I doubt seriously if the legislature will buy that. Many of the legislators have very strong feelings about certain of our categorical programs, such as EOPS, CalWorks, and so forth. So my own estimate would be that despite the fact that the governor is asking for total categorical flexibility, that doesn't mean, of course, that in different ways. And so, but my own prediction would be that categorical flexibility will not make it to the legislature. So before certain constituencies in the community colleges get totally worked up about that, I would suggest that they talk to their legislators, and the legislators will, in turn, respond to that. One of the things that we were encouraged by something that the governor put in his budget, and that was he proposes a 4% annual funding increase to colleges and universities beginning the 2013-14 academic. Now, in our conversation with the Department of Finance, it was made clear that this was a floor, not a ceiling, so that if the revenues, for instance, after 2013-14 rose higher than 4%, certainly it was possible that we could receive more than that. What the governor is trying to commit to, recognizing that higher education has suffered a great deal in the last few years, he is committing to having a 4% annual funding increase to our system and to CSU and to UC beginning in the 2013-14 year. Now, probably that's rather dependent upon this tax initiative passing. And, of course, in a way, I think the governor has placed all of his bets on that. And we'll see how that plays out. I think right now the polling seems to indicate that people are willing to pay more taxes in order to help education. But sometime as time goes on, that doesn't materialize. It's been remarkable to me as I've watched the colleges respond to these extremely difficult and lean years, how well they have been able to make adjustments. Perhaps our string is more or less run out in that regard. I'm sure many of you are finding that your reserves are almost nearly gone, and you've made nearly all the cuts that you can. But if the tax initiative passes, then brighter days are ahead for California community colleges, not only in this budget year, but in the coming budget years.
Thank you very much, Chancellor Scott. And, one other bullet point that we put up there, it's not really a position per se at this point, is many people in the Proposition 98 coalition believes that putting the currently non-98 general obligation bond debt service under Proposition 98 without a concomitant increase in the guarantee might be run afoul of the law. It would be a policy issue that the legislature discussed by the Legislative Analyst's Office, and I think we can wait and see, and leading up to May revise what happens with that. Many people have just joined the call. We're watching our numbers here. As a reminder, we don't have you all on mute, but we ask you to mute your own line by hitting *6. All questions should be submitted online using the CCC Confer interface. Moving on to budget risks, I do want to point out that I've seen the same polling as the Chancellor does, and it has, and there is a strong chance we could get this revenue measure if it's framed for public education in November, but it is both politically uncertain and it is also costly in terms of qualifying it for the ballot and passing the campaign what is already going to be a very expensive election. Additionally, the LAO suggests that the tax measure as currently drafted would only bring in $4.8 billion, although the LAO notes that if Facebook happens to go public next year, that alone could lead to almost $1 billion or something of additional tax revenues. So it's very difficult to project. And I think it's incumbent upon us to point out that we understand how difficult this budget's going to make it for local college administrators working with trustees, faculty, staff, and students to plan for next year. A caveat of 5.56% workload reduction that's going to be decided based on the voters in November and enacted in the current year is going to be very difficult. And we're going to continue to provide, working with the Chancellor's office, as honest information as possible, and we'll help you in that planning process. But the fact is that if the governor's budget was enacted as proposed last week, if you go into next year, assuming 100% of the funds proposed in January, you run the risk of having to make a pretty significant cut in the end part of the fall semester, with cuts officially taking effect in January 1, 2013. So we need to offer that very strong caveat, and we certainly could see additional student fee shortfalls, although the Governor's Department of Finance has projected a 70% Board of Governors fee waiver take rate in 12-13. So they are working very closely with us in the Chancellor's office and being very conservative with the student fee revenue estimates. Property tax shortfalls, particularly with the legal uncertainty of the end of redevelopment. There's currently a case pending in Sacramento Superior Court and several legislative bills that would at least partially restore redevelopment. We can't bank that property tax money either in the remainder of the current year or in the 12-13 year. I'm going to turn it over to Teresa to run through the budget timeline, and then we're going to move into questions and answers.
All right. Again, just remind folks, *6 to mute your phone. As the Chancellor mentioned, we're at the very beginning of this process, and the legislature has yet to engage. So we've got a long way to go before we have a budget, but the good news is that, thanks to Prop 25, the dynamic of the budget passage is a little different. If folks remember last year, we had a relatively on-time budget. The period of January through May, we'll see legislative hearings. The end of January, beginning of February, the Legislative Analyst's Office will weigh in with their recommendations related to Prop 98 and K-12 and community colleges and higher ed, and those are always used as a starting point in the conversations in legislative budget hearings. One thing I wanted to note is, the Department of Finance has indicated to the legislature that they'd like some early action taken on some of their proposals, primarily the ones dealing with the Health and Human Services cuts. But they're also including a request to reduce our apportionment in the current year commensurate with an increase that they're projecting in property taxes for redevelopment. And they're asking for early action to be taken on that. So that's something we're certainly going to keep people apprised of as it develops. So we're expecting May 14th is when the governor will release his May revised, just updated revenues and caseload information, and of course any policy proposals. And of course then June 15th will be the constitutional deadline for the legislature to send the budget to the governor. November 6th is when the general election would happen on certainly the governor's ballot measure, and of course dependent upon whether or not that ballot measure passes. If it passes, this is a moot point, but if it passes, then this is a moot point. But if it doesn't pass, there will be mid-year reductions that would take effect January 1st, 2013. So that's just kind of a quick highlights of the calendar remaining. And I'll turn it back over to Scott.
Well, working closely with the Chancellor's Office and with Teresa working overnight, together we've come out with simulations available today to the best of our ability, and these are rough estimates, estimate the 5.56% workload reduction on a district-specific basis. As they were last year, the simulations are available at ccleague.org/budget. You'll see the statewide number and the statewide number of FTES that will be impacted, as well as a drop-down menu, see what the impact is on your local district. And we'll be driving that down a little bit further into credit, non-credit, and CDCP FTES in the next couple of days, but we did want to highlight that is available today, and we will start updating that website with all budget news now that the campaign has begun in earnest. This is the time to submit your questions via the CCC Confer web interface. I've identified follow-up information for the Chancellor's Office, both on the media side and the technical side. I thank Vice Chancellor Paul Feist, who's here in our office today as well, who's helped us with this. The Twitter accounts for both offices, websites for both offices, and a reminder about the legislative conference. The first question I wanted to answer was asking for specifics on the Cal Grant cuts. I apologize that we didn't have a slide in here. Specifically, the governor proposes lowering the Cal Grant maximum award for students attending private for-profit schools to $4,000. Many of those students get $13,000. Additionally, lowering the Cal Grant maximum award for students attending independent nonprofit schools like USC or Stanford to the CSU award amount. But in particular for community colleges, he proposes raising the Cal Grant GPA requirement for a Cal Grant A, which are not our students, but 3.0 to 3.25, Cal Grant B, which are our students, from 2.0 to 2.75, and community college transfer students after they get to the 4 years from 2.4 to 2.75. That's expected to impact 26,600 students. That has to be part of our advocacy effort this year. Obviously, there's a very difficult budget to balance. We want to ensure that the Cal Grant dollars and the cuts don't disproportionately impact our students. I'll turn it over to Teresa to start some questions, and we'll all be available to field them.
All right. I've got a question from Ann, and her question indicates the Student Success Task Force rejected categorical consolidation. Why did the governor include categorical consolidation in the 12-13 budget? And obviously, would kind of cue this off to any individual who wanted.
Well, I'll simply respond to that. This is not the first governor that suggested that. I recall during Gray Davis's time, he suggested the consolidation of the categorical programs. We discussed this in the Student Success Task Force. One of the proposals in the Student Success Task Force was that they be consolidated in 3 different pots, but that was rejected, and so we will not be supportive of the governor's consolidation of the categorical programs. As I said earlier, my own feeling is that neither will the legislature, because I think many of the categorical programs have a very strong voice, and many of our legislators are extremely interested in the categorical programs, and I might cite something like EOPS and CalWORKS. So it will be helpful for you to express your concerns if you oppose the governor's proposal, but I would say that I don't automatically think that because the governor proposed it, it will happen.
Another question we got in from Gary, and kind of more of a statement and maybe a question in here too. It's some concerns I hear from the public, or if the tax increases are approved, is there a guarantee that existing funding won't be reduced or moved? Essentially, the new taxes won't be seen as a way to shift existing funds to other uses because of the new taxes coming in.
This is Scott, and I have to be candid that this is going to be a difficult tax package to pass. If you poll, it's very clear the voters, particularly voters that are looking at asking the high-income earners to pay a little bit more, voters are generally supportive of that. They're okay with a sales tax for education. But as you've done the back of the envelope calculations from this presentation, a relatively small amount of money from the new taxes, about a third of it, actually goes to K-14 education. Now, we know that $4.8 billion will be cut if the taxes fail, but there will be a lot of ammunition for the opponents. But the question is, are there well-funded opponents? And I have full confidence that the governor's working with the Chamber of Commerce, and they worked in advance on a package that they thought would be most palatable to the business community, and there may be very little formal opposition to the initiative.
And another question from Jim. It says $218 million deferral buyback is not new available funds, but would lessen the cash flow burden multiple deferrals have created for the district. And maybe, Stan, you want to take a stab at it?
Quick answer to that is yes, that's right. As you know, we have about $961 million right now in total system-wide year-over-year deferrals. So the assumption in the budget is that you still have cash obligations in the current year of that 961, and you borrow or use reserves or whatever to tide you over until those dollars come in. So all this, the $218 million in new money is doing in the budget as proposed by the governor is to buy back a portion of that. So yeah, you can't really buy new services with that $218 million. It's simply tidying up the accounting a little bit.
Jim also, or another Jim asks, for budgeting purposes in the 2012-13 year, the base budget should be the 11-12 budgets, which include the 11-12 workload reduction minus this new 5.56% workload reduction in the 12-13 year. That would be a very prudent way to approach the 12-13 budget, either having some sort of set aside or plan to be able to make that workload reduction cut if the tax measures don't pass. I think knowing district reserves, as I look around the state, few districts could withstand an additional 5.56% workload reduction in only the summer session, because even then it'll be too late to cut in the spring semester. So it's unfortunate for our students in that we may have to wait and just decide on summer school after November, but that's probably going to be the fairest way to plan for both the colleges, the students, and the faculty and staff that we serve.
Got a question from Paul, and it basically says, what are your preliminary thoughts on the governor's proposal to no longer use fees to offset apportionment? And that's not the governor's proposal. The fees are used to offset apportionment, so it's certainly not coming in to the level that we've anticipated, or actually the estimate that the Department of Finance had put together, because the take rate has been so high on the Board of Governor fee waiver. And I know that was a question earlier in terms of what's the take rate, and that's just simply the increase that we're seeing in students actually drawing down and going into the financial aid office and applying for that Board of Governors fee waivers. Obviously, when the fee increases, more students are incentivized to go and seek that out rather than not. So another question was asked by Jim. If the 5.56 workload reduction occurs, then is that not an effective 11.2 reduction for the remainder of the fiscal year?
In terms of FTES, which are calculated on a fiscal year, that is accurate. I mean, your overall, the state doesn't give you FTES for fall, spring, and summer. It gives you an annual amount. So since you only have 6 months left in the fiscal year, from Jan 1, 2013, when the cut occurs, until June 30, it is almost a double cut. But you need to look at it from the full fiscal year beginning July 1 to June 30 of 2013. There's a question about, working with the Department of Finance to use the new RDA money to offset apportionment deficits, and this is kind of a technical question. I'm guessing that's one of our chief business officers, and the answer to that is yes. The governor's interest is pulling together, as much revenue as possible to balance this budget. But I think we have a pretty good case, and we'll be bringing that specifically to the legislative consultants in the legislative analyst's office to see if we have some alternatives, particularly given the uncertainty of the redevelopment money.
Another question we're getting is, what are the amounts of the deficits that are being projected for 11-12? Stan,
take a stab at it. Note that we'll have P1 information out in February, and that way we could take a more holistic look at the budget, including the new estimates of property taxes, fee revenue collections, FTS, and a variety of more specific information. But generally speaking, you can add the $72 million Tier 2 cut as a workload reduction, and that's about 1.4%. So if you add that to our initial cut of 6.2%, you're up to about 7.6% as a workload. Of course, we'll be looking very carefully as well at the deficits that our system may well be incurring.
Another question from Joanne deals with the RDA elimination. It says RDA elimination may still be further challenged in court. What if the court challenge is successful and the RDAs are not eliminated as planned?
That's one of the reasons we are going to be talking, in particular, the legislature and Department of Finance, about the irrationality of that March 1st property tax reduction plan for community colleges, because both practically getting the money out of redevelopment agencies into county coffers and over to community colleges in the remainder of the year, and the legal uncertainty makes us skeptical that entire amount will be realized.
Another question dealing with the ballot initiative. Have there been any polls taken as to the probability that the proposed taxes will actually pass? Also, in addition, there was a question about whether or not the governor would be able to clear the field, and kind of throw that out to folks.
Well, I know the governor has been working on clearing the field because there are other groups that have suggested tax initiatives. One was the Democratic Party, one was CFT. Molly Munger had a proposed initiative as well. And in fact, I had a rather extensive conversation with Molly Munger about this matter, because I feel very strongly that if we have 3 or 4 tax initiatives on the ballot, it'll be likely that all of them will go down to defeat. And so I'm very hopeful that all of those who are thinking of a tax initiative will get together with the governor, and perhaps there can be some slight modification or compromise. But as one who was involved in politics for 12 years as a legislator, it's just my idea that if you confuse the public with more than one tax initiative, you then reduce the likelihood that either of the 2 or 3 would pass.
Another question we've got in from Jim. Will workload reductions that have been implemented in the 2011-12 year not be restored in the 12-13 year? And you are correct, Jim. They will not be restored in the 12-13 year.
And it's important on that note, so if you look at the budget simulations, they're up on the website, the base amounts that are shown and the new 12-13 workload reduction in Scenario B, those base numbers are the already lowered 11-12 numbers, including the tiered cuts that we took in January. So it should be fairly accurate, but you add the 2 together and we're at 12, a compounded 12% or more workload reduction, and then add in the 9-10 workload reduction offset partially by a little bit of growth in 10-11. It's really absurd how much we've contracted this system at a time of intense enrollment demand.
Yeah, Jim is essentially correct. So the new money the governor puts on the table for 12-13, none of that is for growth. That's again only for the deferral buyback. So that is not going to relieve the workload reduction at all, or provide new COLA or anything particularly useful.
Got a question from, actually I'm not quite sure who, but they wanted to know the estimates of the impact of the child care cuts on our community college child care programs, and I'm not sure if that level of detail is yet available. This is still being churned through in real time, so I'm sure that information will be available soon, but not yet.
Yeah, this is a new budget. We're just new detail is pouring in each day for us to comb through, and that's something we'll be keeping an eye on for sure. Thank you for your question.
someone asked a question, Laurel, will the PowerPoint presentation be available to download? And yes, that will be available. Got a question from Paul, and who do you see as the primary opponents to the tax increase proposal?
You can be sure that the Howard Jarvis group will oppose it. Normally, there is, of course, a party split in terms of, it doesn't mean that all Republicans vote against taxes and all Democrats vote for taxes, but the higher the voter turnout, the better the likelihood that a tax initiative will pass. And I'm sure we're just hopeful that groups like the Chamber of Commerce and others will come out in favor of the tax initiative because they'll recognize that it's good for the state. And I think a lot of times in selling a tax initiative, for us to point out that really for our colleges and universities and K through 12 to be healthy does so much for the economy of the state. And when we deprive our educational systems, inevitably the economy will take a hit because the economy will lack the trained personnel that education provides. And of course, that's one of the arguments we make always for our wonderful career technical programs in the community colleges, that they are designed to put people to work rather quickly. And we have outstanding evidence proving that individuals' income improves appreciably, almost doubles within 4 to 5 years in those who get a certificate in our career technical programs.
Got another question from MD. So 3 programs amongst the categoricals, that would be DSPS, foster, kinship care, and technology, will be restricted to current use. Does that mean there won't be a reduction or an increase in funding or remain static?
Yes, essentially the funding for the categoricals, the total level of funding is essentially the same as the 2009-10 cuts. So the governor's proposal is just to provide a good deal more flexibility than you have even under the current flexibility proposal.
It's important, that wouldn't lock the money going forward. The question was in the 13-14, 14-15 year, we would expect that each year the legislature and the governor would take a look at both the lump sum of student service categoricals as well as those that have been, if you will, protected. But I certainly agree with the chancellor, and as highlighted in the presentation, it's legally, politically, and even from a policy standpoint, difficult to see how it will all come together that 15 categorical programs are going to be flexible next year. There may be some additional flexibility. I know people argue on either side, but just saying from the Sacramento perspective, it's very unlikely. I do want to note that the PowerPoint is currently available at ccleague.org/budget.
Got another question from Jim. How might the state controllers reporting in today's newspaper that tax collections are coming in below projections impact the budget situation both this year and next?
Well, clearly, we're kind of caught in a dilemma here. When the projections fall below the estimated, it increases the chances of a tax initiative passing, because if suddenly the taxes rolled in at a very high rate, then people would argue or think, well, after all, we don't really need a rise in taxes because the economy itself will solve the problem. It's such a fluid situation. I think any of you who have studied the tax problem in California know full well that unfortunately our taxes in California are very volatile because they're dependent upon income tax much more than they are property tax, and property tax is more stable. Income tax is dependent on such things as Scott Lay mentioned earlier. If suddenly Facebook goes public, and a lot of money is spent, and there's a lot of capital gains that occur. But we have been tied so closely to income tax revenues that it does make the tax situation in California very volatile.
Got another question from Deborah. and the question is, what impact do you see the Student Success Task Force recommendation having? Are the colleges expected over time to absorb these additional functions, or will there be separate funding available?
Well, as you know, the Board of Governors just recently approved the recommendations of the Student Success Task Force. Now, keep in mind, these are recommendations. There's quite a ways before they will be implemented. Some of them will have to be implemented through legislation, which is always a rather lengthy process. Some of them can be implemented through regulations of the Board of Governors. But I don't see a particular impact yet in terms of those recommendations. There is a suggestion, a recommendation, that there be the creation of Student Support Initiative Fund. And that would be helpful in terms of providing the kind of support that's called for in terms of counseling. But all that will be played out in time. If there's any of those recommendations that require additional revenue, of course it would have to then go to an appropriations committee, and there'd have to be a determination on the part of the legislature as to whether they wanted to spend the money for that particular item. And quite a number of the recommendations of the task force actually don't call for any additional expenditure, such things as, say, the student success scorecard that will be developed for each college. Even a central assessment would actually save money in the long run, because every college having to spend money for an assessment instrument is, of course, more expensive than if we had one central assessment. But that will take time to implement, and I don't see anything on the horizon right now in terms of these recommendations that would increase expenses, and so we'll have to wait and see on that.
Got a question from Paul, and does the League encourage community college boards of trustees to pass and publicize resolutions supporting the tax increase proposal?
As you know, we usually put out model resolutions and put it on the website. We anticipate that'll be up in February at the ccleague.org/budget website. We need to take this budget package and our analysis of it to the CCCT and CEO boards, and they will consider both the budget positions as well as the position on the tax measure, this and the other measures at their January meeting.
Got a question from Diane, and is the 4% each year beyond 12-13 just from growth/restoration, or will there be COLA mixed in?
Diana, I think the intent of the governor is to provide us a minimum funding increase of, in this case, 4%, and I don't think the governor is telling us how those dollars are supposed to be spent. So it appears it would be a system decision whether what chunk of those new dollars would go towards COLA or towards growth or toward whatever purpose we see fit. It should be noted that if you look at the LAO's November revenue outlook, they projected over the next few years that the Prop 98 guarantee would grow roughly 4 or 5% a year over time. So the governor's proposal seems to be more or less in line with that. So it sounds like it would be up to the system how we were going to allocate those new dollars.
Got a question from Ken, and it says that at this point, should districts budget for 12-13 based on the governor's proposal, or assume the worst case that the tax measure won't pass in November?
Well, of course, you were faced with that same issue this year when the legislature and the governor came out with a rather optimistic estimate of revenues. And most of you saw the probability that those rosy estimates wouldn't happen. And so you wisely planned so that in case those revenues didn't occur, you could absorb that. And I would think that the same thing ought to be happening next year. I think if you, particularly if you made any kind of long-term commitments with the idea that the tax initiative would pass, I think that would be very unwise. So I guess I would have to encourage you to say, when I was a college president, I always said that you ought to underestimate revenues and overestimate expenditures. And that's kind of the way that I think most wise CBOs and CEOs plan.
Got another question from Mr. Perez, the flexibility, and asking, is the categorical reporting waiver language still going to be in place?
I put that clearly under the heck if we know category. Much of that language is actually in the statute, in the education code, and we would anticipate that when the trailer bills come out, which unfortunately usually isn't until close to when the budget is final, that's when we will know specifically how many mandates might be proposed to be changed. But by then, as the Chancellor pointed out, we expect the legislature will have its say, and particularly for programs like EOPS, I just don't see them being provided an immense amount of flexibility. Although if you have creative ideas, particularly with EOPS and matriculation, about how those programs would work if in a flexible manner, certainly send them up to the Chancellor's office and the League, because if we're all of a sudden put in a position of, hey, everybody make this work, then we'd rather have more alternatives than none at all.
Got another question from, I guess, Napa Valley College. Jose, has the California Community Colleges been able to identify communities or areas of the state where there might be strongest opposition to the tax increases? Can schools in those areas get extra support / resources to engage local groups like Rotaries, Better Business Bureaus, chambers, and local media to give the tax measures greatest chances of success?
Well, I'm kind of the political geek here, although the Chancellor has much more experience than I do. If it's east of I-5, it's against the tax increase. If it's west of I-5, it's in support of the tax increases. And while that's a bit of a simplification, there are deep political divides in California, whether you're talking about party, individuals running for office or tax and policy measures. We will be conducting, if the League boards endorse one or more tax measures, we will be conducting an aggressive campaign, and we'll reach out to every district in the state. There's a good argument about when you're running a campaign, do you dedicate resources in the most conservative areas, or you go into L.A. and the Bay Area and try and get as many voters? Well, our job isn't to work on the partisan side of the election. It will just be to give you the tools to explain to your communities the choices that are made and the impact that those choices have on community colleges.
Got another question from Kathy, and it's following up on that 4% annual increase that was talked about earlier. On that 4%, isn't it likely that some of that will go against deferrals?
Yeah, well, as Scott indicated, whispered just a second ago, I think a lot of that depends on how K-12 gets to deal with their deferrals. We'll probably be riding the train along with them on that issue. I do think broadly it's the intent of the governor to give the system flexibility into how to allocate that 4% when it does come in.
Got a question from Eric. How will these budget changes affect facilities bond programs on community college campuses statewide?
It's an interesting question. It doesn't directly change any way that we get bonds approved or allocate funding for projects. But if this actually proposal to pay off GO bond debt under Prop 98 actually goes through, it might call into question how strongly we support large general obligation bonds, because as it happens right now, when the voters approve no education bonds are paid for out of the non-Prop 98 part of the general fund. So in theory, health and human services and higher ed and corrections and other parts of the state budget are paying the debt service on our facilities. And we've heard that from the administration, some legislators. I don't think that proposal will go through completely. I think that There's a lot at stake for the Prop 98 coalition to oppose that proposal, but it is a relevant question about our appetite for new facilities and how they're paid off.
Yeah, as Scott indicates, what would happen in the future, and let's be clear, I think we know that we do have pretty major facilities needs going forward. I think the 5-year capital outlay plan that our office compiled most recently identifies $30 billion in facilities needs over the next 5 years. So there's a lot of need out there. So if we were to endorse a new statewide bond, that would indicate that those increased payments would come at the expense of FTS or COLA. So that would be a major consideration for the system.
And one more question. Do the new league estimates? This is from John. Do the new league estimates assume a hold harmless for the small districts again? And on the website, they do not assume a hold harmless for the small districts. That was certainly an effort on 12, and you recall at the time, that was a different environment we were in. At one point, it looked like we were looking at over $800 million of cuts, but certainly the system as a whole has weathered a $385 million general fund reduction from 11-12 that, we're perhaps maybe looking at additional reductions in 12-13. So at this time, that reduction, that hold harmless is not in the simulations.
However, the simulations do the workload reduction only on the marginal FTES and not on the basic allocation, which if that was the policy decision that went forward next year, that would on a very, very small basis treat smaller colleges or colleges that rely more on the basic allocation a little bit better. Those are policy issues that we're going to bring to the funding formula task force and decide what's best. Hopefully we don't have to get there. I really want to thank the team that came around the table today. Paul Feast, Vice Chancellor of Communications, Chancellor Jack Scott, Director of Fiscal Policy for the League, Teresa Tena, Vice Chancellor Dan Troy, and all of you for joining us. It's going to be a long budget campaign that we have ahead, but I've gotten a lot of emails from you. I know you're energized and ready to fight, so follow CC League on Twitter, follow CCC Budget News, and stay tuned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.